We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast was recorded, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future. Welcome to the podcast series of Raising the Bar Melbourne, curated by the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences at the University of Melbourne. This special health edition of Raising the Bar, held in May of 2026, featured 20 talks by some of Melbourne's leading healthcare experts and was held across 10 pubs and bars, all in one night. The speakers presented topics ranging from AI and cancer research to understanding ADHD and neurodiversity, helping kids sleep, healthy social media habits, the future of robotic surgery, and much more. In this episode, you'll hear Associate Professor Leo Chen, a psychiatrist and researcher, talk about how brain network therapies offer safer, targeted, and personalised treatments for depression and chronic pain.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Matt. All right, good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here because this is obviously a really big turnout, and people like Matt and I tend to spend a lot of time talking to other scientists, sometimes clinicians, and the delivery sometimes become a bit scientifically prosaic. So to be able to engage with the community is really exciting for me, and what I hope to be able to share over the next 30 to 40 minutes is to discuss and outline a very novel and a pretty cutting-edge area of neuroscience and how we can translate this into better understanding the brain and developing better treatments for people living with neuropsychiatric disorders. So just before I start, I also want to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and welcome any First Nations people that might be here with us this evening. I was a clinician first and then a researcher, and I still have a clinical practice. So I always like to also acknowledge lived experience of people who have or are having or have had difficult mental health challenges, or who might have cared for a loved one who have endured mental health challenges. As a clinician and also as a researcher, it never ceases to amaze me just how much resilience and how much fortitude our patients and their families have, and they serve as a continual inspiration for me to continue to drive forward in this field to come up with better answers. Over the course of my talk, I will be using the nouns consumer, client, patients interchangeably. All of them come from a place of deep respect. Can I please get a sense from the room, because we're meeting for the first time, and we have been given a run sheet of the people who have registered, but they've only got first names, initials, and how you found out about the event. I would love to know whether people are scientists, clinicians, students. Maybe if we can start with students. Who in the room are students? Science students? Medical students? Engineering students? Students of life? Well, okay, great. Any like postgraduate scientists? Amazing. What about clinicians? Great, okay, a whole bunch. Journalists, recruitment agents, I don't know, publicans trying to, get this event over at their establishment for next year. Okay, well, it's great to meet all of you, and I'll look forward to being able to engage together in this forum over the course of the evening. And if there's anything that people might want me to repeat or sort of go into a little bit more explanation about, we do have sufficient Q&A time at the end. So please let me know, and I would love to clarify some of these concepts. I might start with a story, actually. Okay, I'll start with the story, seeing as I introduced myself first as a clinician. So I trained as a psychiatrist. I did the majority of my training at the Alfred Hospital. and spent a lot of time working with patients and their families. So I'll tell a story about a woman who at the time, 10 years ago, Claire, her name is Claire, and she was 32 at the time. She was a health professional. She was an allied health professional for a major Melbourne hospital. And about 10 years ago, she gave birth to her first child. She was in a loving marriage. They were expecting their first child. Both Claire and her husband were over the moon about the new arrival to their family. But unfortunately, after about a few months after giving birth, Claire developed very severe postnatal depression. For the first time in her life, she was already not sleeping well, but she was no longer really sleeping hardly at all. She was constantly worried. She had no energy. She had no motivation. Nothing would give her joy. She also started having thoughts of not wanting to be around, but she was trying to stay strong for her newly arrived baby son. But she was also very agitated the whole time. You know, whenever she was awake, she couldn't stop worrying about whether she was a good enough mother, whether she should cuddle the baby this way. Maybe she was bathing the baby all wrong, and this was feeding into her sleep. She wasn't sleeping, and this became a really vicious cycle. She was already on parental leave, so she didn't have to work. But, you know, the thought of maybe eventually being able to recover from this illness, from depression, and like I said, she was a health professional, she was health literate. But the possibility of being able to recover from this and get back to her life as the weeks and as the months wore by became more and more slim. She was a health professional. She did everything right. She reached out to her GP. She tried to get some of her lifestyle and she enlisted support from her family. She did what she could. But it was very, very difficult, you know, when she was feeling like a not good enough mother, when she felt like she was a failure, when she felt guilty about being a burden on her husband. Those thoughts are very hard to change when you're right in the thick of it. And when she did have those waves of panic and anxiety and really agitated anxiety, there was nothing really she could do that could calm her down. And there was only so many hours per day that she could just retreat and go and hide under the doona and try to sleep it off. But she did the right thing, and she saw a GP and got started on antidepressant medications after trying behavioral modifications, enlisting support. She also saw a psychologist, but again, some of these cognitive strategies, behavioral strategies are very difficult to engage in when your depression or anxiety is that severe. So she did the best she could. She saw a psychiatrist and tried an antidepressant medication. For those who might know, with antidepressant medications, we generally start at a starting or low dose, take some weeks to build up to a therapeutic dose, sit on that dose for at least 3 to 4 weeks before the effects really kick in, right? It's not like taking a couple of Panadols when you have a headache and you can expect the headache to go away within about 2 to 4 hours. With antidepressants, we're talking about 2 to 4 weeks. She tried one antidepressant, it didn't work. She tried another, again, it didn't cut the mustard. She ended up trying 5 antidepressant medications and she was still feeling miserable. And as like I said, her chances of, her hopes of recovering and having a normal life, you know, at a time when she had expected this to be one of the happiest and one of the most fulfilling times of her life, was starting to not really the reality that she was living. So Claire was in a pretty bad place at this time. I'm going to park Claire aside, all right? I know I'm holding the audience to a cliffhanger now. We'll come back to her, I promise. But maybe if I can get a show of hands, and I won't make this sort of too uncomfortable, but who has ever felt nervous? Okay, it's probably most of the room. Who has felt anxious? So anxious is a sensation and an emotion where people have this sense of apprehension, unease, they can't relax and they can't shake it, right? So take yourself back to, even just momentarily, I won't make this too uncomfortable, but take yourself back to a time when you felt really, really, really anxious. Like, you've got a flight to Bali, you're going on holidays, but for some reason you read your itinerary wrong and the flight is taking off in an hour and a half's time and you're leaving here now. Now, magnify that anxiety tenfold, and that anxiety stays with you for 10 weeks or 10 months. Anxiety is probably the most common symptom we have in mental health. Depression is not far behind. It's a very, very uncomfortable feeling. And as psychiatrists, we're actually not that good at treating it. We're not good at treating a lot of the problematic challenges that our patients live with day to day. And I just picked one symptom or one experience, if I could, in anxiety. I could have chosen fear about gaining weight. I could have chosen obsessional beliefs. I could have chosen auditory hallucinations. I could have chosen paranoia, right? Even as I was just going through these from 1 to 5, just counting them on the fingers I have in my hands, all of them are terrible. All of them are terrible experiences to have, right? And to live with them is really something that I wish we could do more for our patients in terms of trying to ameliorate some of this discomfort and some of this suffering. Okay, so maybe one point I'd like to make at this point is I think mental health symptoms are not unrelatable. We all have had feelings of anxiety or depression or nervousness, maybe even paranoia for some of us, right? And they're all pretty distressing symptoms when these symptoms arise. But I think one clear demarcating point about mental health symptoms and physical health symptoms is with a lot of the mental health symptoms, even though they're fairly mild, when you get them, you want them to go away straight away. They are terrible, right? Remember how I sort of asked the crowd to imagine when you were feeling particularly anxious, and if that stayed with you over the course of the day and that's what you woke up with and that's what you went to bed with, it's hard to function. It's hard to go to work, it's hard to concentrate, it's hard to even drive a car while, being a safe driver. It's hard to cook a meal, right? Whereas with a lot of our physical health symptoms, such as, again, mild symptoms, I'm not talking about sort of excruciating medial spinal chest pain because someone is having a heart attack or something like that, but, when you have lower back pain, when you have a headache, when you have pins and needles in one of your limbs, a lot of people can live with them, right? But with mental health symptoms, they affect all domains of our lives. And over a period of time, they do start to tarnish our sense of competence, our identity, what role we play, and we start to lose confidence in ourselves. So again, maybe just reinforcing another point about, the severity of mental health symptoms. And this has been well studied. When you look at data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, mental health and addiction problems still rank as the highest in terms of burden lived with disease in Australia. Mental health conditions don't necessarily kill as many people as cancer and cardiovascular disease, but in terms of lost productivity and the quantum of suffering people have while they're alive, mental health is still right up there as number one. And our treatments haven't advanced as far as, a lot of these other fields, particularly, say, like oncology and cardiovascular medicine. Maybe if I can pivot to a bit of a personal story of mine. I got into medicine because I wanted to help people. I loved to be able to work with people to understand them and alleviate their problems or their suffering or their pain or their disability. After medical school, working for a few years as a general doctor, I chose to specialize in psychiatry because of this realization. Because when you have mental health, you have good health. And when you have bad mental health, you have no health in any domain of your life. It doesn't matter how strong your arm is or how good your sight is. Without mental health, everything else sort of falls by the wayside. However, and this is where I'm getting to the slightly bad news now, but as I was a psychiatry trainee at the Alfred, and passing my exams and becoming a senior registrar, working as an early career consultant psychiatrist, I started to feel dissatisfied by the limitations of our treatments in mental health. For those who might be aware, we have behavioral strategies, psychological therapies, we have medication therapies, and we do have one form of treatment called electroconvulsive therapy, a form of brain stimulation therapy, which nowadays is very safe and very effective. But for the most part, a lot of the conditions that our patients and their families are presenting to us with, we don't have very good answers for. And this was about 20 years ago. Right? And, even till now in 2026, the advancements that we've made in psychiatry has probably not kept pace with what a lot of other specialty fields in medicine have made. So tonight I'm going to talk about one field in psychiatry which I think is promising. It's not the only field. I certainly hope it's not the only field. And if 20 or 30 or 50 years' time we meet each other again on the street and you say to me, that night at the Royal Melbourne Hotel you told me about brain stimulation and brain network therapeutics and you thought this was going to be gold and it's not and we've got something better, I would be very happy. If there's something else that can trump this, bring it on, right? We just want better outcomes for our patients, their families, and the communities that we serve. That is all I care about. But I'm a brain stimulation and a brain networks neuroscientist, so I'll stick with what I know, and I'll talk about this particular field. But before people start to get a bit upset with me, I better finish telling the story about Claire. So I was referred Claire for an assessment and treatment, and she received a form of treatment called transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's often shortened to be TMS, or repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it took the depression away. She got better. She went back to as if she wasn't depressed 18 months prior. Now, everything wasn't exactly hunky-dory. She had moments of, she did have episodic relapses, and I'll talk about TMS in a little bit more detail, but it's like any intervention that we have in medicine. If I put a pacemaker in your chest and it's regulating your heart rate, if I turn it off, the erratic heartbeat might come back. Right? If you have high blood pressure and you're taking an antihypertensive and you stop taking the antihypertensive, your high blood pressure might come back. And the same thing with brain stimulation treatments like what Claire had. She had a course of TMS, the depression went away. This is the best treatment she's ever had. She said very clearly at the time she really thought this saved her life. Right? But the effects did wear off. She did need to have repeat treatments, top-up treatments, but she was able to get through about a very hard, altogether looking back now, a very, very hard 3 to 4 years of her life, the hardest 3 to 4 years she's ever lived. And she survived it. She was able to, after being treated with TMS, she started to function a bit better. And then in a sort of almost like a cascading way, the depression became more manageable because it was less severe. Right? And all the other very helpful treatments and strategies that we have, getting support from family, partners, exercise, behavioral strategies, mindfulness practice, then they were actually accessible because the depression went from like a, negative 1 million to maybe just a -5, and it became more manageable. So TMS, so what is it? So the concept is actually pretty simple. We have a big stimulator that probably looks about half the size of this speaker. It looks like 2 big PCs stacked on top of each other, and it delivers a very large current through a magnetic coil. And I brought a TMS coil along to show what it looks like. So that's what a TMS coil looks like. The current passes through here, and it goes through these copper windings through, this is a figure of 8 coil. You can get coils in various different shapes and forms. And using the principles of electromagnetic induction, it induces an electrical field in any conductive tissue that it's touching. So in this case, we're talking Claire's brain, or neurons, the superficial neurons of Claire's brain, actually. This is what my brain looks like about midweek. You don't want to see it on a Friday. You'll need a microscope by about Friday. So we place the coil over the head, and it induces a secondary current to any conductive material that is located within 1 to 2 centimeters of the coil. The penetrance of electromagnetic induction is not deep. it can only induce these electrical fields in conductive material that is actually adjacent or touching it. But with repeated pulses that are fired, it changes the activity level of the region of the brain that you're stimulating. And during one treatment session, we will apply hundreds or thousands of these pulses. And with repeated pulses, it changes the activity levels of the network that the stimulated region is connected to. So if I can explain that in a slightly different way, we have various things in this room that are connected in a circuit or in a network, such as these 3 lights, for example. I'm going to presume, I don't know because this is not my pub, but I'm going to presume there'll be a light switch somewhere around, and when you turn that off, all 3 will go off. Okay, so if I can modulate or if I can manipulate that light switch, I'm manipulating everything that light switch is connected to. Right? I don't have to get up on a ladder and actually fiddle with the light bulbs. That won't be very good OH&S, and might get in trouble with the university for doing that. But the idea of brain stimulation, or the other name that's used is called neuromodulation, is by targeting networks of the brain to induce changes in network connectivity to change mood, cognition, behavior, or motor symptoms that we might be interested in. When you think about it, those are the 4 key tasks that our brains do. We think, we are who we are, our identity, spirituality, our recognition of our own sort of theory of mind. So the cognition, movement, darting eyes, moving hands, pacing across the stage, emotions, we think, and so mood, cognition, behavior, and emotions. So I suppose then the question is, if we can find networks that can correct some of these aberrant mood, cognition, motor symptoms, etc., we could potentially develop treatments for anything that the brain controls. Okay, so I'll park that for a second and come back to Claire and come back to TMS. So the TMS technology has been around for quite some time. The first machine was engineered in 1986. It was first engineered by someone called Tony Barker, who was an engineer who was very familiar with the principles of electromagnetic induction. Michael Faraday discovered electromagnetic induction in 1836. So it's nothing new, right? It's older than all of us in this room. And Tony was an engineer. He wasn't a psychiatrist. He wasn't interested in mood disorders or depression. But he was just tasked with say, hey, you know all about electromagnetic induction. Can you engineer a machine so we can study the brain? Because the goal about something like TMS is that you can stimulate the brain non-invasively, right? Otherwise, to try to do changes to the brain, what I would normally have to do, and sorry to sound a little bit gruesome, but what I would normally have to do is to anesthetize the patient or not, and take away a piece of scalp, you get a little buzzsaw and you cut away a piece of skull and then poke electrodes in. But with electromagnetic induction, you can induce these secondary currents, or what we call E fields, despite the presence of impedance, or despite the presence of tissue that is not very good conductors of electricity, such as hair and skin. And for those who are also interested, it's not the only technology that induction is used in. Induction is what gets you home tonight because your alternator was working to charge your battery, right? For those of you who cook with an induction cooktop, it's called an induction cooktop because there are magnets underneath that are rapidly moving, and it's causing the electrons in your water to collide with each other to generate heat. And it's thought to be the most energy efficient way of heating things these days, which is why many houses these days are built with induction cooktops. But I'm not a chef. I'm going to come back to talking about Claire and brains. So TMS has been around for about 40 years, and it was first done to treat depression just over 30 years ago now. And fast forwarding 30 years of lots and lots of research and lots of clinical trials, it is now an approved and an evidence-based treatment for depression. In Australia, it's been TGA approved to treat depression since 2007, which is why Claire was able to access it. And since 2021, in November 2021, it was also issued MBS item numbers for. So people can access TMS at a TMS clinic, and they would get a Medicare rebate, so there's less out-of-pocket costs. So that's great. We've got, answers for people with depression, particularly treatment-resistant depression, which is the bulk of the patients that TMS trials have evaluated. So people like Claire, people who have, tried and, did their earnest with at least 2 antidepressant therapies and psychological therapies and haven't benefited. The evidence base is built on treatment-resistant depression. So going into the next generation then of brain network therapies, and so where can this technology be pushed, right? Because, I said that TMS was first done to treat depression in 1996, 1995. You're not here sitting here today to hear me talk about something that happened in, when we used to listen to cassette tapes, right? Well, you want to talk about what's coming after the MP3s, right? So where things are now in this field is to try to better understand brain networks and how we can uncover novel networks through advanced and sophisticated computational mathematics, really, to try to better understand where these networks lie and how we can then target these networks to treat mental health conditions. Have people heard of the phrase, neurons that are wired together fire together? Right? So that concept is not actually particularly new, but turns out that is actually true. So since the late 90s, mid-90s, late 90s, there were advancements made in imaging techniques. So specifically, I'm talking about nuclear imaging techniques like PET scans and SPECT scans and magnetic resonance imaging. Prior to that, the only imaging techniques we had were ionizing radiation. So you pass radiation beams through the body, and depending on how much radiation uptake is in varying tissue, you can get a picture of what's bone and what's flesh and what's heart. And, so it wasn't able to distinguish really within matter of the same material what's doing what, right? And what the activity levels of certain structures are. So that's what MRIs and nuclear imaging techniques allowed us to do, particularly with a technique called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. The concept is not particularly sophisticated, but the computation is extremely advanced. So I'll just sort of break it down. When you have someone lying in an MRI scanner, and there are these big magnets that are turned on and off, and the vector at which they're firing is constantly changing, what it's trying to do is it's trying to see how the electrons in the cells in your body are responding, right? Because these electrons are electromagnetically active. So if you fire magnetic fields, it'll resonate in a way that allows the computer to very quickly pick up what the cells and what the tissue is doing. When you have someone lying in an MRI scanner over a period of time, so for 5 minutes, for 20 minutes, for 30 minutes, what people discovered in the late 90s was there will be changes in oxygen levels in different parts of the brain. Say, this is the prefrontal cortex, I'll just borrow that. This is the intraparietal sulcus, I'll just borrow that. There will be different parts of the brain where the oxygen levels are changing at the same time. So they're lying in the MRI scanner just at rest spontaneously. There will be oxygen levels changing, going up, going down. And there'll be other parts of the brain, in this case, because this is blue, it's nicely sort of pointed out, I'll just show that. This is the primary motor strip. And hypothetically, when there is oxygen level changing at the prefrontal cortex, let's say the oxygen levels are going up, but the motor cortex is going down, right? So over the same time window, there'll be parts of the brain that are positively correlated in terms of activity level, and there'll be parts of the brain that are negatively correlated by activity level. At the beginning, people thought that was just spurious. That was just, I don't know, like the brain just does weird and wonderful things and it doesn't have any meaning. But what people realized was that this was reproducible and this was happening all the time to people, and provided that their brains are healthy, their signatures of changes in blood oxygen levels, and this is going to challenge my dexterity now, but anti-correlated changes in activity levels is reproducible across large populations. So these must be telling us something. And bringing back that notion of neurons wire together, fire together, we've come to realize that every part of the brain is connected to each other, right? Through white matter tracks. It's a little bit like if you wanted to get from Spencer Street Station to Chadstone, there will be a road that will bring you here from Chadstone. If you wanted to find a road from Spencer Street Southern Cross Station to Northland, there's another road that can get you there. But what we don't know is when the brain is doing something, is it Southern Cross Station and Chadstone that are working together? Or is it Chadstone and Northland that's working together? Right? Which is why it's called functional MRI, because we're not just looking at the structural connectivity, we're looking at functionally how are different parts of the brain connected. So over time, people sort of collected thousands of these brain scans, and they were able to build what we call a normative functional brain atlas. So this is sort of like the normal kind of average human beings functional connectivity atlas. And what you'll need to do is disassemble my brain. Maybe that wasn't what is required. Yes, thank you. I'll try not to step on it. It might be painful. I don't know where to buy one of these spare parts. What's required is I'll use the blue strip again. That's the primary motor cortex. What you need to do is you need to use this part of the brain. This is we call it a seed, and then you can see what parts of the brain are functionally connected to that area of interest. Okay. Now I'm going to take that and move it forward one big leap and talk about a technique called lesion network mapping. So if we can think about traditionally how people have thought about how we understand the brain, traditionally how we've come to understand the brain is we looked at different forms of brain injuries, and after the brain injury, people lost the ability to speak. After people have had a left middle cerebral artery occlusion, they developed right-sided hemiparesis, for example, cause and effect, brain injury and effect. And what we'd like to then do is think about, okay, if there's a behavioral symptom or a mood symptom, such as depression, of interest, and if we can find the causal lesions that led to that abnormality, then we should be able to find where that behavior lives, right? So then we can look at how we can stimulate or we can devise treatments based around that knowledge. So the premise is fairly straightforward in that we look for all causal lesions that cause a particular symptom. Let's call it anxiety, or let's call it right-sided hemiparesis. And we search for all published cases of brain damage or lesions that have caused that particular behavior. But what happens is we find that all of these are heterogeneously distributed. Rather than these lesions all being at one spot of the brain, even for anxiety or for depression, they tend to scatter all around the brain. So then you think, how can that be? How can depression be all over the brain? How can paranoia be all over the brain? But when they mapped it to that normative brain atlas, people realized that, yes, they don't map all to the same region, but they all map to a common network. I'll pass this around if people wanted to have a look at them. They all map to a common network. So if we can then, for example, find 20 cases of this behavior of interest, whether it's anxiety or paranoia or hemiparesis, And we map each lesion to the functional network that is connected to, and then we stack up all of these networks, and using specificity and sensitivity testing, we should be able to find the network that is implicated in that behavior of interest. So I think this is where the field is currently at and where it's potentially going. On this piece of paper with very small writing, these are all the various behaviors and moods and conditions and thoughts and motor symptoms that have had lesion network mapping done to them. It is a technique that was initially devised by neurologists at Washington University, St. Louis, and the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. But now it's all pretty much done around the world, including at the University of Melbourne. And as a psychiatrist and as a clinical trialist, and still always thinking about people like Claire at the front of my mind, we're using similar techniques to find causal lesion mapped networks for anorexia. And that does exist. You know, it was a bit challenging to find, but we did find cases of people who did not have anorexia, but because they've had a small tumor in their brain, they developed the syndrome that we as psychiatrists call anorexia. So fear of gaining weight, preoccupation with body image, refusal to eat, protracted weight loss, etc., etc. So then we can devise this network for anorexia, or it can be for another condition. We're also looking at testing a brain network that was derived from lesions that cause people to spontaneously stop smoking. Most of the time when you have a brain lesion, they're usually nasty. You know, it's a minor form of brain injury, or if you're a brain network person like me, it disrupts the network. But occasionally people can have brain lesions that are helpful. You know, there are brain lesions that cause people to abruptly stop smoking. There are brain lesions that make people to just casually and easily reduce alcohol consumption. So this is now the addiction remission network. And we're trying to think, well, you know, if people have undergone a period of alcohol detoxification, for people who have alcohol dependence, alcohol use disorder, if they go through detox, we know that about 96% of people who undergo alcohol detox relapse, particularly in the first 2 weeks after detox. So if we can stimulate their addiction remission network using a non-invasive and a safe form of brain stimulation, maybe it will prolong their sobriety. Maybe it will help them to not have to react so much to alcohol cues, because we know that's all around. So I'll draw a bit of a close to what I'm talking about here. We've covered a fair bit of terrain, actually, initially thinking about mental health and psychiatry and how troubling psychiatric symptoms are, mental health symptoms are, to talking about the lack of progress in our field for a fairly long time, and to maybe one field that we think is very promising because it leverages causal inference, which has always been the bedrock of medicine. And we also leverage neuroscience, and we use empiricism to understand the brain, and we use safe and non-invasive forms of brain stimulation to reinvigorate or to re-energize these networks that might give our patients better solutions and better answers, whether it's for anxiety, depression, anorexia nervosa, maybe alcohol addiction as well. So very happy to take any questions, and hopefully we in 10 years' time we'll meet again. And if I'm wrong and we have better treatments, so be it. That would be fantastic. But otherwise, maybe this field will continue to progress, and we'll realize that the brain is actually an electrical organ. All our treatments have been chemical, and maybe that's one of its limitations. And our behavioral and our psychological therapies are very effective. I don't want to say anything contrary to that fact. They are very effective, but for people who have severe conditions, they are so hard to internalize. They are so hard to internalize. And with these behavioral therapies, we ask people to change their behaviors so that we can change what's being driven from the brain. Why don't we get to the cause of the problem? These are brain conditions. These are brain disorders. Why don't we try to safely understand and stimulate the brain so that the behaviors don't actually the behaviors don't actually surface at all? Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Leo. It's really engaging, informative talk. I mean, you took us through cassettes and Spencer Street Station too. It was kind of interesting. But anyway, we've got some time for audience questions. The way this is going to work tonight is there's a roving microphone somewhere. Who's got the microphone? There it is. If you've got a question, just pop your hand up. The microphone will get to you. So with that, let's open up.
Hi. Firstly, thanks for an excellent talk. Very interesting. Can I just check that I've understood it properly? I want to use the analogy of the London Underground. So if we've got a whole network, you're saying that you can do TMS at Edgware Station on the Metropolitan line and affect the other end of the station, which is how it gets through the deep tunnels, because it's only got 2 centimetres, did you say? 2 millimetres of depth? Right, so Metropolitan line might be addiction, Northern line is pain, whichever one it is, we just stimulate the right station and affect the whole network. Have I got that basically right?
Spot on.
Perfect.
That's the easiest question ever. I was sweating a bit because I don't know the London tube system very well. And if you had said, if we can get the Pakenham line, that should work, and the Alphington line. Yes.
So my next question, if the problem is the Metropolitan line, and we've got all the way across London, all the way across the brain, we have this network, it seems... How much skill does it take to hit the right station? We can hit any of the stations and have a positive effect.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Excellent question. I didn't touch on that. So we have these neural navigation systems that basically registers the person's structural MRI scan with my facial, let's say it's my scan, with my facial features, as well as where the TMS coil is located. So in 3D, in real time, I can make sure that where I'm stimulating is precisely the pinpoint on the MRI that I want to target. But yes, fantastic question.
It's sort of a similar question. Like people who have MRI scans of their brain don't lose their depression, their diagnostic scan. So when the mechanism's unclear, how do you work out location, dose, duration, the periodicity of the treatment?
Yeah, because that's another really good question, because TMS is not just TMS. We talked about it very briefly over about 30 seconds tonight, but there is an infinite array of stimulation parameters, coil configurations you can apply. And we don't exactly know what's the best parameter or the best protocol to apply for any particular condition. Some of that is trial and error, and a lot of that, and certainly in my clinical trial designs, is informed by the existing depression studies. And we sort of borrow their stimulation protocols, their treatment durations, the number of sessions, and maybe that's not the right way to go about it. But what gives us a little bit of confidence is when you apply TMS as a single pulse, as a single session, as repeated sessions, you can measure changes to the brain using EEG or MRI. So as that technology continues to develop, maybe we'll get a little bit more feedback when we apply TMS, what it does to the brain, learn from that, so the next time around we can do the TMS differently or better.
Well, people with bipolar disorder are more likely than the general population to be creative. Do you know where that connection is?
I don't have a scientific response to that, but I agree. It's something that we've seen quite a lot of as well. Whether it's because of the profound effects that mood changes have on us as people, whether we're going from the depths of depression or to higher states of euphoria and elation, or even during that transition, can give us some pretty profound sort of realizations about life. And maybe that's what drives their artistic preponderances and their expression, but it's more philosophical, I'm afraid, than scientific. But it is something that we see quite a lot of.
Hello, Leo. Given TMS has been around for a long time, and obviously it's difficult to see strong effects and lots of barriers, etc., where do you see the next sort of evolution of the approach coming from in terms of step change versus it might just be incremental change that sort of gets us a bit closer? But I'm really curious whether you anticipate a bit of a step change in that methodology.
Yeah, you're quite right, because there are only limitations to what TMS can achieve. It's superficially stimulating, the effects can wear off, even for treatment-resistant depression. And I didn't cite the response rates, but when you look at all the large clinical trials, about 40 to 50% of people with treatment-resistant depression benefit from it. So it's not 100%. I mean, none of our treatments in medicine are 100%, but still 40%, 50% could be better. So I think there will be better technologies that will come, in the goodness of time. One method of trying to improve TMS's effects is by more precision functional connectivity guided targeting. So at Melbourne Uni, we're doing a trial comparing that. We're doing a randomized trial where people with treatment-resistant depression, they either get functional connectivity guided targeting or just generic targeting, and they don't know what they're getting. We don't know what we're giving. The randomization ensures we just get a coordinate, but we don't know what it maps to. So we want to see if that might help to boost TMS's effects. We just finished a trial deliberately using mechanistic pharmacological augmentation of TMS's cellular effects to boost its treatment effects, and the results are positive. We still need to actually we still got some follow-up data that's coming in that we need to sit down and analyze, but so far that's looking promising. But I have to be a bit careful with what I say now, but I'm not personally entirely wedded to TMS, if I'm honest. I see this as a technology that has a role to play now, and it does help a lot of people like Claire. But in some ways, I hope we're not doing TMS in 50 years' time. I sort of see TMS as, if I can use this analogy, I sort of see TMS as a cassette player in the whole spectrum of brain stimulation techniques. It had its role to play. I remember being 12 years old and I saved up enough money to buy a proper Sony Walkman. I was the happiest kid on the block, right? And then after that, even compact discs are now redundant. And the first generation iPod, that's now redundant. I don't know what we'll do after Spotify and Apple Music, right? I don't have that forecasting ability. Neither do I have the forecasting ability to see what will come after TMS. A lot of people think it might be focused transcranial ultrasound because it's got much more spatial resolution. So what I mean by that is TMS is fairly diffusely stimulating and also superficially stimulating. But with ultrasound, getting it right, you can go as deep in the brain and you can perturb tissue as little or as much as you want. So that's something that's being investigated. It might be ultrasound, it might be something else.
I'd just like to preface this. I'm not a scientist in any way, shape or form, so apologies if this is a simple question. But I have a lot of relatives in regional Australia, and I know from experience that it's very difficult to get care there. And when you're saying a psychiatrist needs to kind of undertake this care, diagnose, and I'm just wondering how accessible this is and if what the possibility is of opening it up to making it even more accessible.
So if I can just talk about only TMS specifically, otherwise, different modalities have their various forms of logistical challenges. But with TMS, like the way that TMS has been done for the most part in the last 20 to 30 years have been daily treatments over 4 to 6 weeks, which is logistically untenable, for people who might have difficulty accessing or needs to drive a long way, which is why accelerated TMS has now come to the fore when you can do like a whole course of 20 to 30 treatments in 2 weeks as opposed to 6. There are also 1 week protocols. So there is a particularly well-known protocol called the Stanford Accelerated Intelligent Neuromodulation Therapy Protocol, which is why it's called SAINT, that does 50 TMS sessions Monday to Friday over 5 consecutive days. So when you're talking about that kind of course duration, it becomes more accessible for people who might need to travel down from, Mildura or Bundaberg or wherever that might be. There are also now, as of about the last 12 months, there's also been a protocol that does a course of TMS in 1 day. That's also being investigated.
Thanks, Leo. I was just curious on how the neural mapping that we've discovered through TMS might be informing ECT practices, if at all.
Getting a bit technical here. I suppose two things. The first is the at least putative, because no one knows for sure, but the putative mechanisms by which ECT works and TMS works appear to be very different. ECT probably, whereas TMS, at least the most commonly subscribed hypothesis, is that it facilitates healthy brain transmission and network connectivity across all the subway stations, right? With ECT, it's passing energy, inducing a seizure, and it's after the seizure, when the brain tries to go into a state of homeostasis, that the neuronal genesis and the antidepressant effects might start to play a part. The only sort of brain network mapping study that I'm aware of that looked at ECT is they looked at a large collection of people who have had ECT, about 200 people who have had ECT, and they found that irrespective of what ECT electrode they use, whether it's bitemporal, right unilateral, or combination of the electrode placements, that the network that was engaged are the same network. And the degree of functional network engagement actually correlated with how much people's depression got better. So maybe the brain network hypothesis is also helping us to better understand how ECT works and the network that it's engaging. And just as a spoiler alert, the network that's engaged is the same network that TMS tries to stimulate to treat depression. So the same subway line.
Thank you so much. Hi, Leo. And my question is, for the neurodivergent people, is the TMS also an effective way for them to stimulate the prefrontal cortex area, or only target some symptoms about anxiety and also depression? Thank you.
Good question.
I was going to say, can you do that in a minute?
Yes. Yes. It can be done, whether it's got different effects in neurotypical and neurodivergent populations, we don't know yet, but it can be done.
Okay, that's about all the time we've got for tonight. Can you please give Leo a final round of applause?
Thank you for listening to the podcast series of Raising the Bar Melbourne, a special health edition. If you want to listen to more Raising the Bar talks, head to rtbevent.com/podcasts.